All right, let's bring in Adam Pascale, who's the chief scientist over at the Seismology Research Center in Melbourne. Adam, good to have you on the show. From a seismological perspective, I mean, is it normal to have two magnitude 7+ earthquakes within pretty much the same area within such a short time window?
It's very unusual. It doesn't happen as often to have such large aftershocks. Only probably in about 10% of cases where you have an earthquake of this magnitude, you would have an aftershock that was not much smaller. Usually we have the largest aftershocks are about 1 magnitude unit smaller, and one did happen. A 6.7 happened only 11 minutes after the original. And that would normally be what the largest you would expect. But in this case, we had one that was only a few points smaller within 9 hours. So it's certainly unusual.
Do larger magnitude earthquakes generally tend to produce more in terms of frequency aftershocks?
Yeah, there is a relationship between the magnitude of the original earthquake and those of the aftershocks and the duration that those aftershocks will continue for. So it does ease off exponentially. So the longer that we go with reducing magnitude aftershocks, the less likely there is that there will be a larger event in the sequence. But that can never be ruled out. The Earth continues to surprise us, unfortunately.
This will go down in the history books in terms of being one of, if not the most powerful on land strike and slip quakes. Talk to us about the significance of that.
So often when we have large strike slip earthquakes, they are often offshore at plate boundaries. Here, the earthquake has happened at a plate boundary where the Arabian plate and the Anatolian plate and the African plate all meet together. And in this case, all of that section that ruptured was onshore, and it looks like to be between 200 and 400 kilometres long, the rupture of the original event.
The fact that, I mean, 200 to 400 kilometres, is that a particularly long fault line?
It's related to, that's how we measure the size of the earthquakes, in fact, how much of the fault ruptured, or the size of the rupture area for the fault. And that is, you know, for that all to be on land in a large earthquake is, it doesn't happen very often. Often we'll have these plate boundaries that are offshore, you know, the famous ones off the US coast, San Andreas, and all that area, off Japan. So often they are separated from the population because they're offshore. In this case, that earthquake was very nearby the population and also relatively shallow. So a lot of that energy actually got to the surface, whereas it would normally be dissipated through many more kilometres of Earth.
Talk to us about some of the factors that actually play into the scale of destruction. We talked about the magnitude, and you just briefly mentioned the depth. What other factors play into the crisis, the sheer destruction that we're seeing?
So there are a number of factors. Obviously, we mentioned magnitude and depth, and that depth is a very important factor because it just puts everyone that much closer to the earthquake. The fact that population centres were also very close to the epicenter, you know, highly densely populated areas within, you know, tens of kilometres of the epicenter causes that destruction. The fact that large aftershocks were happening so soon after the original shock, that first earthquake has caused severe amounts of damage, but then the aftershocks being very large and very near afterwards, sort of compounding the effects and causing more and more damage. And then again, 9 hours later, having another almost equally large earthquake is just adding to that. The fact that it also happened at the time of day that it did has had a much larger human impact, being at 4 o'clock in the morning. People were probably waking during the event and not having as much time to react, to prepare themselves, to protect themselves. So all of those factors have really compounded to make this a terrible tragedy.
Adam, I'm wondering if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about the amount of energy that's been sort of released as a result of these two powerful earthquakes. I know a lot of us have been reading up on everything that we can, and there have been comparisons made on a range of issues. But when you look at sort of at least 6,000 buildings being completely demolished, the death toll now surpassing 15,000 people across 2 countries. Talk to us about the energy that's been released as a result of this.
So as you may know, with earthquake magnitude, we always describe it as a logarithmic scale, in that when you go up at 1 unit of magnitude, we're saying that earthquake is 10 times bigger. And that's in the amplitude scale, but in the energy scale, we're talking about 32 times larger. So every time you go up, and if we go up 2 magnitude units, you're talking about 1,000 times more energy being released. So this earthquake, this first earthquake, has released 32 times more energy than the largest earthquake in this region before. And then to have a second event of similar magnitude releasing that much energy again is just phenomenal. It's an enormous amount of energy that's built up over many years. Obviously, there's no history of a large earthquake like this in this region, but obviously it's happened over the millennia, but not in recent times, in recent memories. So it's very significant in that there's been so much stress build up, then to be released all at once with all these aftershocks and large aftershocks as well.
The epicenter in Kahramanmaraş, it is near significant in this respect, that it is the convergence of multiple plates. You have the Anatolian plate, you have the African plate, and the Eurasian, but there hasn't really been that much sort of any significant seismic activity there in the last 40, 50, 60 years.
That's right. I mean, most of the events have been of a smaller magnitude. They've still been impactful events and caused, loss of life and damage, but not to this degree. Obviously, most of the earthquakes in recent years have been concentrated on the northern Anatolian fault, which is stretches basically across the country, and there have been concerns of that as it approaches to the west. That they're looking at that last section of the fault being activated near Istanbul.
Yeah,
and then for this section here to be triggered, it is one of the factors that is a surprise for most people.
What does the scientific community say in terms of an earthquake happening on one particular fault, and then perhaps causing a domino effect and it affecting other adjacent fault lines? Like you mentioned, this happened on the Eastern Anatolian fault line. Is there a possibility that it could cause potential increased seismic activity on the Northern Anatolian fault line? And I ask you that because you have some very large cities like Istanbul which are very near the Northern Anatolian fault line.
That's right. I mean, we do see triggering of other faults from large earthquakes. So, and in fact, the original earthquake here ruptured along 3 different faults. So it started on one, started ripping along it, and then activated another section of fault. So there were 3 different sections of the East Anatolian fault that were triggered by that initial rupture. Then all of the aftershocks that are happening on nearby faults along there, and the main aftershock that's happened is on an adjacent fault. It was not directly connected to the first structure. So yeah, you've got that compounding effect of this energy, this stress change, changing the dynamics of the Earth in that area, moving some faults closer to breaking, and others perhaps moving them further away from breaking. So it does change the dynamics across the board. How far it reaches really does relate to the magnitude. And I think we've seen the extent of the triggering of that initial event across the East Anatolian fault, and not too much activity on the northern section at this stage.
All right, Adam Pascale, thank you very much for joining us here on our continuing coverage on TRT World. I do appreciate listening to your analysis. Thanks very much for joining us.